on time until just a minute ago when the gentleman came, changed the clock, and said we're starting late. So, for those whose watches aren't on time, please adjust them according to the School of Medicine. I want to thank you all for coming on behalf of the Urban Health Institute. Excuse me. Today's presentation and discussion is part of our series that the Urban Health Institute began more than a year and a half ago or so. That is our Race and Research Symposium series. And really the intent of this series is to engage in conversations between researchers within the university here at Hopkins and people, our colleagues and neighbors in the Baltimore and East Baltimore community around research, its uses, its abuses, its potential. And so it really is in that spirit of dialogue that we have the session today. Today's program will be presented by Professor Jonathan Metzl, and it is based on the work that he has done and recently published as the protest Psychosis, looking at the transformation of the diagnosis of schizophrenia from the 1950s until the present time. Jonathan is a psychiatrist and additionally received his doctorate in American Studies. He has a joint appointment at the University of Michigan as an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and in Women's Studies, and he is the director of the Center on Culture, Health, and Medicine. And I think that working as a clinician, as a historian, and as a researcher brings some very unique perspectives on the issues of diagnosis and the issues of the interface of mental health, mental illness, community, and the politics of the times. The way that we run these sessions, and thus the way we will run it again today, is that after Jonathan presents, we have 4 very distinguished and very wonderful respondents. And I will introduce each of them after the presentation. So thank you very much for joining us, and we greatly look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much. I've been instructed to double mic here. Feel a little bit like Janet Jackson. Hey. Well, thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful for me to be here. I feel like I've figured out the microphone system, which will be the most difficult thing that I'm going to be doing today. But it's really a great honor on numerous levels for me to be talking here and to this audience. On a personal level, it's really wonderful because, as we talked about today at lunch, Bob has been a friend, a supporter, a family friend for a very long time. And on a professional level, as I'll be talking about over the course of my talk today, the work that I've been doing looking at the history of schizophrenia and the changes in the diagnosis of schizophrenia lead to a series of assumptions and arguments about what I think we can do to intervene, particularly in areas of the intersection between race and psychiatry that, to my mind, are very much in line with what the work that's being done at the Institute here is in trying to think about the relationships between the psychiatric diagnostic intervention and the larger social, political, historical context that interaction takes place in. And so I'll be talking a bit about that more toward the end, but let me just say as a bit of preamble that the book that I've written and the research that it comes out of research that I did looking at a very unique archive. I was lucky enough, honored enough to access the archive of a hospital that I'll be talking about extensively toward the end of my talk called the Ionia State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Now, this was a hospital that was roughly 3 hours north of Detroit, about an hour and a half north from where I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And this was a hospital that was, I mean, people today really haven't heard so much about the town of Ionia. It's a small place in the middle of nowhere. But in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, across the country, if you told somebody Ionia, Michigan, they would have immediately associated what you were talking about with this very notorious hospital, the Ionia State Hospital. This was, as I'll be saying, a 450-acre hospital, 400 acres of farmland, 50 acres of large Gothic buildings, and housed thousands and thousands of patients over the course of the 20th century. There were numerous stories that came out of my work in the archive. I accessed and went through the archive for a period of years. But the key story that kept coming up again and again was a story about the racialized and gendered transformation in the diagnosis of schizophrenia that happened in the hospital. And the key parts of that story were that I pulled 600 or 700 charts randomly between 1930 and 1975. And what I found was that the charts that I was pulling from the 1930s, 1940s, even early 1950s, the diagnosis of schizophrenia was invariably given not only to the hospital's very large population that was categorized in its own census as being a member of a category called U.S. white. At the time, the hospital was thought to be about 95% white. But also, the hospital was about 30 or 40% women, and almost all of those women were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the different kinds of diagnoses that these women would get were this woman was a shoplifter. She created a public disturbance. There's one case that I write about in the book where a woman, her diagnosis was she got too loud and embarrassed her husband. These were different reasons that got you ended up in the psychiatric hospital at the time. And all of a sudden, and you know, I'm not going to comment on that except to say that there was a transformation, and really there was a dramatic shift that happened between that time period and the 1960s and 1970s. And really it was so radical that in the 1970s, early 1970s, all the charts we pulled from 1970 were of African American men, particularly diagnosed with schizophrenia. These were men who were from urban Detroit very often. A good number of them had participated in the Detroit riots. Some of them had been members of black protest groups like the Black Panthers or the Nation of Islam. And schizophrenia really became the diagnosis of these men. In fact, again, 8 out of 10 of the charts that we pulled of these men carried the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And what happened was the women, some of whom were still in the hospital, they were all re-diagnosed with depression or bipolar disorder as these men became the new schizophrenic players in the hospital. And so this question of what exactly was happening in the hospital, why was it that this diagnosis shifted so radically over such a short period of time and really embodied such a radical shift in the kinds of patients, the ways the patients presented, became the foundation of the book. And as I started to tell this story, it started as a clinical story because I'm a clinician, but it started to broaden outward and outward, broader and broader, to the point where the story of these men in the Ionia Hospital became a way of telling a much broader story about the interactions between race and racial tensions and psychiatric diagnosis. And for me, became a key point for understanding two very important stigmatizations of schizophrenia in the present day. So with that as a bit of preamble, let me start in the present day and say that, as you've just heard, I'm somebody who actually has a split appointment in the University of Michigan. And on my Mondays and part of my Tuesdays, I'm a member of the psychiatry department. I treat patients in the outpatient clinic and in the psychiatric emergency room. And if you ask me on one of those days, what is schizophrenia, I'll give you an answer with information that's somewhat linked to information that's based in this slide, which is to say that in my psychiatric persona, let me just move that up a little bit. In my psychiatric persona, I hold that schizophrenia is an illness that has symptoms, at least now before the DSM-5 comes out, that are marked by delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, social withdrawal, sometimes cognitive decline. And these symptoms are the result of a variety of different factors: environment, development, genetics, etc. But there also are explanations that are based in a broad and really oversimplified approach that's called biological psychiatry, which says that at its core, these symptoms are caused by aberrations either in brain size or brain matter or in the functioning of different neurotransmitters such as dopamine or glutamate. And if you're not biologically inclined and you want to remember just one finding from this talk, it's that according to biological science, and actually, according to biological science going back about 30 years, schizophrenia is an illness whose prevalence should be about 1% of the population no matter where you are. In other words, because of genetics, that's the way this argument is coded, 1 out of every 100 people, no matter where you go, who they are, 1 out of every 100 people should somehow be afflicted with schizophrenia. Now, this number is not itself, I'm not supporting this number, and it's been, some people say should be revised down. Some people are actually saying that it's a bit lower. But what was interesting for me going back through psychiatric textbooks is that this 1% number has been played again and again in psychiatric textbooks going back easily to the 1970s. So that's the Monday-Tuesday version. Then if you talk to me on a Tuesday afternoon or a Wednesday or a Thursday or Friday when I'm wearing the hat of a cultural historian or somebody who tries to understand not just the clinical or scientific basis of mental illness, but also the cultural story of what it means to have a mental illness in the real world, I'll tell you that those findings, particularly biological and psychiatric research findings, are often in tension with two very important, what we might call stigmatizations or misperceptions or issues that play out in the real world. Now, one of these issues is the literature of the so-called misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis of schizophrenia. And basically, the argument here is that even though I've just told you about this 1% number, if you're an African-American man living in the United States, you can pretty much pitch that number right out the window, because according to research that dates back to the middle 1960s, and to me that's a very important finding, African-American men are overdiagnosed with schizophrenia at rates of 4, 5, 6, even 7 times more than other demographic groups. And African-American men are underdiagnosed with depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, and other kinds of findings. So again, a finding that emerged in the 1960s. A second place where we might think that there's a tension between clinical research and attitudes about mental illness is in the so-called stigmatization of schizophrenia as being a violent disorder. Now, this is a very prevalent disorder. It's one that I feel like is related to the point about race that I was just making. But this story goes that basically in American culture, persons with schizophrenia are very often represented, assumed, feared for being unduly hostile or violent. There have been a series of research studies, one by the media study scholar Otto Wall, who argued that if a person somehow diagnosed with schizophrenia commits a crime, that crime is something like 57 times more likely to be overrepresented on the nightly news. There are a series of studies about people's attitudes, and one is actually actually, this study by Watson, Corrigan, and Adati that appeared in Psychiatric Services a while back. And basically, this study was a study of police officers' attitudes. And what they did in the study was gave a series of two vignettes, two very identical vignettes, to police officers in the Chicago area. In the first vignette, they said, Bob and Sam get into a fight. Bob pushes Sam and tears his coat. You're called to the scene. What do you do? In the second vignette, they say, Bob and Sam get into a fight. Bob pushes Sam and tears his coat. Bob has schizophrenia. You're called to the scene. What do you do? So two very identical vignettes, neither of which says Bob's running down Main Street with a sawed-off shotgun in one hand and a bottle of malt liquor in the other. It's what they call minimally intrusive violence. And all they do is vary whether or not the perpetrator of the event has schizophrenia. And what the researchers found was that simply by adding the word schizophrenia to the vignette, the police officer's perception that the perpetrator was violent went from roughly 15% to upwards of 60%. A dramatic increase simply by adding this word schizophrenia, even when every other variable remained the same and the actions were the same. Now, you might think, well, this is something that's particular to the police, and it might be, but there have been very important research studies that come out of Columbia most recently, Phelan and Link, some sociologists at Columbia, who basically show that this is a misconception that's also prevalent in American society. In fact, in one very important study that appeared in the American Journal, what they showed was that even though there's been a dramatic decrease or increased acceptance in American attitudes about illnesses ranging from depression to anxiety to obsessive compulsive disorder, American attitudes have decreased for all of these issues over the 20th century. The only increase in terms of stigmatizing markers that they found were American popular perceptions that they feared people with schizophrenia. So this notion that they're violent and might do something about them. Now, these findings are important for a bunch of reasons, but one first is that there is no racial basis for schizophrenia. We've done a great deal of work in psychiatry in terms of understanding genetics, neurobiology, but there is no finding that says that a particular racial or ethnic group somehow has schizophrenia more often. That's slightly an oversimplification, except to say that a lot of the research that's being done, at least up until this point, is done at the biological level, at levels of the brain or the brain functioning that ostensibly occurs beneath race, gender, class, etc. And a second related finding is actually that the stigmatization of people with schizophrenia as being violent in many ways is at odds with real events. Now again, this is a slight oversimplification. The numbers go up if you add substance abuse, for example, and there are instances of kind of famous schizophrenic crime, but my favorite study that deals with this is a study by John Brecky and Kathy Prindle at the USC School of Social Work a couple of years ago. And what they did was study actual police contacts in which somewhere in the police report, the perpetrator or the victim was mentioned as having schizophrenia. And what they found is that between 2000 and 2005, looking at 7,000 police contacts, upwards of that if there was somehow schizophrenia mentioned in the criminal report, the chances were 65 to 130% greater that the person with schizophrenia was going to have the crap beaten out of them by someone else, rather than that they were going to be the perpetrator of a crime. And of course that makes sense if you think that people with this illness appear odd, eccentric, talk to themselves, something like that. But in a way, what they found was that the popular stereotype was exactly the opposite of what was happening. Now, for better and worse, we've tried numerous ways to deal with these issues in psychiatry and in medicine more broadly. We've tried to train people in objective disease criteria. We've instituted training in so-called cultural competency, which is something I'll be talking about and maybe just poking a little bit of fun at a little bit later in the talk. We've tried public information campaigns, and yet these two specific stigmatizations, these two issues, misdiagnosis and stigma, have continually risen despite our interventions, and the question is why. And so the argument that I make in the book is that even though these issues seem like they're very much present tense issues, that they're things that are happening in the here and now, that actually you can't understand how we got to the present moment in terms of understanding misdiagnosis, race-based misdiagnosis, and stigma against schizophrenia as being violent, unless you understand an important transformation that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, which is the story I really tell in the book, which is how before that, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and early 50s, schizophrenia was an illness that was very often associated with docility, with a kind of white genius, and I'll be giving some examples of that in a minute here. And all of a sudden in the 1960s and 1970s, you see the evolution of these stereotypes in conjunction with incredibly political American conversations about race, and particularly in the context of American debates about the civil rights era, the civil rights movement, and particularly civil rights violence. And so what I argue is that these two issues in schizophrenia really are remnants of this important transformation. Now, I make that argument in three intersecting ways in the book. The first is that I trace changing American popular and medical assumptions, representations about schizophrenia in mainstream American media, American medical and psychiatric journals, and in the African American press between 1940 and 1980. The second part of the analysis is that I then use that cultural history to try to understand the transformation that I was talking about before, to try to understand what's happening at the Ionia State Hospital. And then the third part is to say that I think it's very important for people in psychiatry and people in the community to understand cultural history in order to understand not just misperceptions or stigmatizations of schizophrenia, but also why people in the community might mistrust psychiatry in its handling of this particular issue. And what I'd like to do for the remainder of my talk is give examples of these three kinds of analysis, and I'll just do it chronologically. So let's jump back to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And I'll tell you that if you were a member of the American mainstream in that time period, and I said to you schizophrenia is an illness marked by violence, you would really have no idea what I was talking about. Because according to American popular sources, most predominantly, schizophrenia in the 1930s and 1940s was an illness marked in very different ways. One, here's an article from the New York Times from 1935, and one was with schizophrenia was associated with white male genius. People would make the argument that great white novelists, poets, playwrights, etc., all were touched by a particular symptom of schizophrenia. It's one of my favorite words. Feel free to whip it out at a cocktail party. It's grandiloquence. People felt that people with schizophrenia were touched by grandiloquence, which meant a propensity toward flowery prose. That because they had schizophrenia, they could really turn a really great phrase. Now, of course, we think about bipolar disorder that way in the present day. But it's important to note that bipolar disorder was a very, very small category at the time, and schizophrenia was a very broad category, and it was associated, first of all, with white male genius. An earlier term was called dementia praecox, and it was frequently associated with conditions found in the seclusive, sensitive person with few friends who's been the model of behavior in childhood. Popular magazines such as Collier's ran exposés where they basically invited white middle-class people to open their doors to other white people with schizophrenia, basically saying invite them in either as boarders or to share a meal with them. Particularly in the 1930s, there was a very popular genre of what was called the schizophrenic biography. People would tell biographies of famous people in history who had schizophrenia. And the two most common subjects of those kinds of biographies, first was T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who apparently had schizophrenia according to the logic, and it caused him to spontaneously take trips on a moment's notice. He would become very moody and withdrawn, and all of a sudden he would take trips. And the second person was Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of President Abraham Lincoln, who would either be sad, tearful, withdrawn, morose, and then all of a sudden would get in a great mood. She would go out and spend all of Abe's money on these shopping sprees. Now, of course, again, this sounds very much to us like bipolar disorder. And also because we know about histories of Abe Lincoln, we also know she was probably acting that way because Abe was stepping out on her. But I hope people have read that biography. But at the time, these symptoms were attributed to schizophrenia. Now, also in the 1940s and 1950s, schizophrenia became a very popular metaphor in women's magazines. The word schizophrenia literally means split mind, and what people argued was we, the women of the United States, and particularly the white women of the United States, are split, our minds are split because we've got to make breakfast for our children and do the laundry and be the perfect wife and do all these kind of things, and it's literally driving us crazy in a particular way. And this theme probably got its most public airing in a 1948 film called The Snake Pit, starring Olivia de Havilland. Anyone here besides Bob seen this particular movie? So I don't mean, well, I'm going to ruin the plot for you, I apologize. Except to say that this was a film that was based on a 1946 autobiographical novel by a woman named Mary Jane Ward. And basically it told the story of a woman who had had a successful career living alone as a single woman in the 1940s. She'd been a newspaper reporter and really was doing pretty well on her own. There's this guy who was wooing her and finally she gives in and she's like, okay, I'll marry you. She gets married, and about 3 days into her marriage, all of a sudden she suffers a psychotic outbreak, which is manifest by her inability to recognize her husband, among other symptoms. So of course this means that she has schizophrenia. They cart her off to a psychiatric asylum, and they do numerous treatments. They put her in a kind of modified jacuzzi, hydrotherapy treatment. They do all kinds of things. The most important is that they do psychoanalysis with her. And they keep saying, you know, tell me about your parents, tell me your parents. But she's not cured throughout much of the movie. In fact, she gets worse. And they keep bringing in the husband about every 20 minutes. And they'll be like, who is this guy? And she'll look up in a kind of dazed way and say, dude, I have no idea. And that means that she still has schizophrenia. All of a sudden, she has a kind of psychoanalytic breakthrough where she realizes, of course, that it's all about her father. They bring the guy back in about 10 minutes to go, and she's like, darling, I love you. And this shows that she's cured. They embrace, they let her go, and they go off into the suburbs to, I guess, like reproduce or whatever people were doing in that era. But the point here is that on one hand, the Snake Pit was in many ways a path-breaking movie. There weren't a lot of movies being made about mental illness at this time, and particularly mental illness in the asylum. But it reinforced this notion that schizophrenia was an illness that inflicted mainly docile white women. This is also a theme that played out in early antipsychotic advertisements in medical journals. Here's an ad from the American Journal of Psychiatry from the early 1950s. And again, it shows white women suturing away their symptoms with the help of early antipsychotic drugs. Now, let me be very clear that in no way am I making the argument that all people in the United States who suffered from an illness called schizophrenia in the 1920s through the 1950s were members of a category called white. And in fact, there were entire hospitals, mostly in the South, so-called Negro hospitals, where schizophrenia really was the only diagnosis given to every single person in the hospital. And I was just at the Carter Center speaking, and we were doing kind of the history of these hospitals, and the conditions were absolutely appalling. It was an absolutely terrible existence. The point I'm making is that you wouldn't know that if you looked at American mainstream media, really across the board in many ways, where schizophrenia really was presented as an illness of the mainstream in ways that encouraged identification with particular groups of people, like Olivia de Havilland, and rendered other groups of people, like people in Negro hospitals, invisible to popular perception. So jumping forward to the 1960s and 1970s, I'll next say that pretty much everything I've told you goes out the window in the 1960s and 1970s, where there are a series of dramatic shifts in American popular representations of schizophrenic illness. Now, one of the places that this transformation occurred was in American popular culture. This film is from a 1963 Samuel Fuller B-movie classic called Shock Corridor. Anybody here seen that movie by any chance? Well, I highly recommend it. It gets a lot of press because there's the infamous trapped on the nympho ward scene, which is, worth the price of admission by itself. But for me, this movie is important because it's shown as the follow-up to The Snake Pit. This is a movie, again, about a psychiatric ward. It takes place in the 1960s. only here it's a men's ward. And the key scene of the movie is that you're introduced to the new schizophrenic character. This is a man named Trent, played by an actor named Harry Rhodes. And this is not only an African-American man, but it's an African-American man who participated in civil rights protests. He had initially joined nonviolent protests, had attempted to desegregate schools, and had been a desegregation protester, and over time becomes increasingly despondent with civil rights, to the point where he becomes not only a racist himself, but also a violent protester. And in the film's key scene, he actually starts a race riot on the ward. So again, one place is that this dramatic popular shift in representations. Another place is that the FBI 10 Most Wanted list started showing up in the 1960s, and all of a sudden America gets introduced to new kinds of characters, particularly kind of crazed black male schizophrenics who are allegedly on the loose and kind of running wild across urban America. And another place that's very important is also in the pages of American psychiatric journals. Now, before the 1960s, and again this is a slight exaggeration, many of the psychiatric research studies about schizophrenia were done, not all, but many, were done in white-only wards, in segregated wards. And there was an assumption about the kind of monolithic nature of schizophrenia. And all of a sudden in the 60s, you see these comparisons, hallucinations and delusions in white and Negro schizophrenics. This assumption that, okay, we're studying people now on desegregated wards, and here are these black patients that have schizophrenia, and here are these white patients that have schizophrenia, and they don't look the same to us, and so we're going to compare them and see if it's the same illness. And invariably, what these research studies would find was that the white forms of illness were very often marked by cognitive decline or intellectual decline, but the black forms were marked by bodily hostility or anger. And so the question that I ask in the book is, what happened? How is it that in this amazingly short period of time, assumptions about the race and the gender and the social class of schizophrenia shifted so dramatically and so radically? And what I'm specifically looking at are a series of key mechanisms that happen in the context of the American Civil Rights era and the American Civil Rights movement that, as I argue, helped shift our assumptions about what schizophrenia is. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all of those three mechanisms today. And so I'm just going to mention two of them very briefly, and then I'll spend some a bit more time on the third mechanism, and then I'll conclude. But the first mechanism is that in American popular culture, schizophrenia became a very potent metaphor for race. Now, I mentioned before that the term schizophrenia literally means split mind. And in an expanding number of popular articles and popular representations, people would use this idea of a split mind to talk about not only a racially split country, but a country that suffered symptoms much like when the two parts of the mind came in conflict with each other, when the two races came in contact. And the most prevalent term that I track in the book is this idea of racial schizophrenia. And so here's an article again from the New York Times from the 1960s, and it says, states, towns, and even individuals seen torn by a sort of racial schizophrenia in which Negro equality is simultaneously accepted and rejected. So here, segregation itself is kind of represented as a metaphor of the mind and vice versa. A second venue that I don't have time to talk about today is this is not just a top-down narrative where it's coming from white mainstream culture and going down. Schizophrenia also becomes a very important metaphor and trope and way of speaking within the rhetoric of civil rights itself. And not only is that the case, but it also becomes a metaphor that ends up representing or helping talk about the important divides between violence and nonviolence in the civil rights movement or in the civil rights era. So on one hand, in the book, I talk about 12 or 13 Martin Luther King sermons or writings where King very frequently talked about schizophrenia the way he does. This is from his famous Unfulfilled Dreams speech, his last speech at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And he says, there's a civil war going on. There's a schizophrenia, as the psychologist or psychiatrist would call it, going on with all of us. And even though he mentions us, he's specifically talking about the black mind. And there are times that all of us know sometimes there is a Mr. Hyde and a Dr. Jekyll in us. What King is saying in these instances is basically that there is a split, an adaptive split that's happening in the black mind between good and evil, between violence and nonviolence. And he uses this to argue for the importance of choosing the path of nonviolent resistance. And what I say in the book is actually that it's a mistake to attribute King's use in particular of schizophrenia to something he was simply borrowing from psychiatry, because really what's happening here in part is that he's tapping into a much earlier philosophical tradition, notably Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, to talk about the adaptive split that has to happen to live in a racist society. Now, on the other side of the ledger, people coming from the Black Power or Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, etc., often talked about schizophrenia as well. Schizophrenia was very frequently talked about by Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Robert Williams, Rap Brown, and a host of other activists and authors. Now, on one hand, this was a very real issue because many of these men were actually being diagnosed with schizophrenia by the FBI. And if anybody doesn't believe that, please email me and I'll send you my PDF copy of the Malcolm X FBI psychiatric profile, where they actually diagnosed Malcolm X as having schizophrenia. Robert Williams, a famous leader of the NAACP who advocated for militant nonviolent resistance, there were posters across the South that basically said, "Wanted angry black male schizophrenic on the loose," with Williams' picture. So this schizophrenia was not just a kind of random thing. It was actually something that was being diagnosed in a lot of leaders by the FBI. But also there was a real debate about what schizophrenia was. And people on this side of the trajectory were basically saying either, yes, we're schizophrenic, but we're schizophrenic because of the impact of racism. And the only way that we can fight back against this is to promote something other than nonviolent resistance. Or, yes, there's an illness in society, but the illness itself is not in the black mind, it's in white society. So either way, schizophrenia was shown as being much more of a different kind of protest identity and metaphor. Now, the third mechanism links to what it was that I was just talking about, which are the very specific ways in which the history of the latter part of the civil rights era, and particularly what I was just talking about advocation of resistance to white mainstream norms, made its way into psychiatric diagnosis, where again and again I found arguments that participating in black protest itself caused black men to go crazy. Now, if you don't, well, I don't want to just keep plugging my book, so I'll just say that I found numerous examples of this, and I just want to show you a couple of them. This is an article from the Archives of General Psychiatry that was published in the aftermath of the Detroit riots in the late 1960s. And this was an article that got a lot of credence. It was called The Protest Psychosis. I took the title of my book from this. This was an article written by two New York area psychiatrists, Bromberg and Simon, who worked in New York hospitals, and what they said was, there are new kinds of schizophrenic patients coming into our hospitals. These men have changed their names to Islamic names. They come in with the physical sign of the clenched fist, and what they have, I'll just read to you, the particular symptomatology we have observed, for which the term protest psychosis is suggested, is influenced by social pressures, the civil rights movement, dips into religious doctrine, the black Muslim group, is guided in content by African subcultural ideologies, and is colored by a denial of Caucasian values and hostility thereto. This protest psychosis is virtually a repudiation of white civilization. So again, the argument being made here is that simply by participating in civil rights, either you were crazy to do it in the first place, or being part of this movement was driving you crazy. Now, it was not limited to that article. Again and again in psychiatric research studies, one study said that if you even participated in sit-ins and you were black in America, you had a higher rate of schizophrenia. One study by the sociologist Brody went so far as to say even if you were black and you thought your civil rights were being violated, you were at a higher rate of schizophrenia. Now, nowhere was this narrative more problematic than in advertisements for antipsychotic medications, again from the nation's leading psychiatric journals from the 1960s and 1970s. The ads I'm about to show you appeared in the American Journal of Psychiatry and the Archives of General Psychiatry, really the probably two most important journals of our field. And all of a sudden, you see this transformation in the 1960s from representations of those peaceful white women sewing from before to ads that, on one hand, either specifically play with this kind of African theme that was prevalent at the time. Some of these ads quite literally reproduced what could easily be called racist terminology. People who know that the history of the word primitive, which is often used in kind of contradistinction to civilized. And again, these are ads for antipsychotic medications. And probably the most problematic of these was an ad for the antipsychotic medication Haldol that appeared in the late 1960s. Again, in the second most important psychiatric journal in the country. Now, this is an ad that, again, appears in the aftermath of the Detroit riots. Anybody want to just do an audience participation thing here? Anything jump out at people from this particular ad? James Brown, and I have to say it was not an accident. This looks like James Brown. James Brown, of course, also had an FBI file and was very politically active, especially in the aftermath of King's assassination. So definitely James Brown. I guess other things for me, I mentioned the sign of the clenched fist, only in Black Power. The Black Power fist was the protest fist. Think about the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. All of a sudden, it's an inverted Black Power fist, one that might punch the psychiatrist in the nose. The ad before was something that took place in a hospital setting, and all of a sudden, you see that this is an urban setting. This person's in street clothes. And there's almost an orange hue in the background, as if to suggest that this is something that's happening in the background of the riots. And you see this incredibly problematic text: assaultive and belligerent cooperation begins with Haldol. And so, really, what's happening here in a crass and way that's pretty unbelievable, even for the context of the 1960s, is this conflation between a clinical pathology and what's being presented as a social pathology, and basically saying that Haldol is the treatment in either way. Now, that's probably the more obvious example. Another point that I talk about, kind of beneath the radar, is that in the 1960s, the definition of schizophrenia itself is changing. Now, we know now from the news that the DSM-5 is on its way, and on one hand, I think there's something great about a profession that is not afraid to just throw out the book every 15 years and kind of say, let's look pretty closely at our diagnoses. But that happened in the 1960s, particularly in 1968, in ways that were incredibly problematic as far as I'm concerned. Now, in the first edition of the DSM, the DSM-1 came out in 1952. And that text defined schizophrenia as what was called schizophrenic reaction. It basically argued that schizophrenia was a split mind, and that people who had it had different personality problems. All of a sudden, in 1968, probably the most charged political year in the history, in the 20th century across a variety of countries, definitely here, you see a new definition of schizophrenia in the DSM-2. And importantly, they add the terms hostile and aggressive attitude and projection. Those had not been in the DSM before 1968. Now, let me be really clear. I don't think that there was intentional I don't think that this was an example of the people writing the book trying to reflect the cultural, political mores of black politics at the time. And I've done some oral history interviews, actually, with people who worked on the DSM-2. And I think that I believably recorded from them that they were saying we were using what we knew at the time and we were trying to do our best. But I will say that there were some profound unintentional consequences of phrasing the diagnostic term in that language. I'm doing a research study now with 2 grad students where we're basically counting up the use of different terms in American psychiatric case studies in leading psychiatric journals in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what we've found, to make a somewhat a needlessly complex chart more simple, is that in the 1960s, those terms aggression, hostility, projection, criminality, aggression, in the 1960s, 8 out of 10 articles that we pulled that mention those words do so referencing black people with schizophrenia. So there was a very racialized effect of this language change, which interestingly for us, we haven't published this yet, dissipates over time. By the 1980s, those terms become associated with the category of schizophrenia independent of race. But in the 1960s, there was a very strong racialized component of this association. So with that being said, I'll just say a few words about the point that I started the talk with and say that I've used this cultural history to tell a story about what I feel like is happening at the Ionia State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a place where these larger cultural stories really played out in ways that materially impacted the lives of people who were in the hospital itself. Now, we like to, anybody here from Michigan by any chance? So in Michigan, we like to talk about our state as being, oh, thank you. It's like a kind of oven mitt we point to. And so Ionia County is like about the 4th metacarpal, about right there. And again, this was a very large 450-acre hospital, 50 acres of Gothic stone buildings, 400 acres of farmland where the criminally insane would go work off their insanity like a kind of Weberian summer camp or something. And part of this was the kind of standard asylum. Thank you for laughing at that joke. Part of this was the kind of standard asylum that you would think about, big, scary place. But what I found in looking at the records was that there wasn't a lot of fear of the patients with schizophrenia in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and early 1950s. Again, as I mentioned, the hospital was, even though this is a staged publicity photo that shows desegregation, it was nominally desegregated at the time. This was a largely white hospital, and the people with schizophrenia largely were the women. There were at the time great trades in the arts and crafts produced by the Ionia schizophrenic women that would be sold at the Ionia State Fair every year. Every year, Ionia's schizophrenic patients would also construct a float for the Michigan State Fair parade. This is the one from 1933. And you see basically Ionia's schizophrenic women kind of waving to people going down Main Street. I would definitely say that if we had like a state fair float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade now, it probably wouldn't look exactly the same, but at the time there wasn't a lot of fear. Now, the fear story starts to come in the 1960s and 1970s. We see changes in hospital architecture. Again, the demographic of the hospital itself shifts quite dramatically to the point where by the mid-1970s, the hospital is roughly 70% African American. Most of the patients come from urban Detroit, not from the rural Midwest. As this happens, you see moats and barbed wire go up around the fence. And you know where this story is going, which is that in 1977, the Ionia State Hospital becomes the Riverside Correctional Facility, a medium security prison that actually stood until last year. And I was lucky enough to actually go on a series of 10 or 11 different visits to the prison complex itself before it closed. And I talk about it in the end of the book, what that meant. And for me, the astonishing part of those visits was that I'd been studying these pictures and this story and this history and really had been living in that world, and then I went to the prison and I expected it to be like some totally radically different thing, and instead it really was stepping back in history for me because all of the buildings were pretty much still there. And even like the famous Ionia water wheel, the words of, the superintendent's home, all these places, I just kept going around and I'm like, oh my God, here's where this happened, here's where this happened. And they would look at me like, we have no idea what you're talking about. We just work here, and I'm like, don't you know this used to be a really famous hospital? And they would look at me like I was really, they didn't have a sense of what I was saying. And so for me, this complex actually became a very important symbol for me because it was a complex that was not just imbued with a particular history, but a very particular race history that impacted the way it was formed. Now, I just have about 5 more minutes. I hope that's okay. I just want to conclude, but I'll say that that part of this is that this institution functioned in a very similar way to the ways that race functioned toward the end of the hospital, which is that Ionia itself, if you look on the website of the town of Ionia, it says Ionia is a town that's marked by its cultural diversity. In fact, 35% of our residents are African American. We all lead a great life here. And then you go up to the town of Ionia and you're walking around and you're like, where is everybody? Because it's pretty much about the widest place that you've ever been in your entire life. And I'm like, is everybody like at Denny's, or what's going on here? And it took me a minute to figure out actually that they were counting the prison in the census data, and that really this 35% came almost entirely from people who were incarcerated in the prison. And so I coined the term Midwestern multiculturalism to say what I think is happening here, which is that there's this particular structure that happens, and it basically fills a very similar function, which is this racialized structure in the context of a very white rural environment. And so, in a way, what I argue is that even though, of course, prisons and hospitals are very different, if you look historically, they're performing some of the very same social functions.
Is that a state or private facility now?
State, yeah. And now it's actually, I can go into it in a bit, but they keep condensing it into older and older psychiatric institutions. So now it's all in the Michigan Reformatory, but it's state. It's state, yeah. And so, really, this idea of the prison that stood reliving the past but with no knowledge of the past became my way of understanding the issues that I led this talk with, which are these stigmatizations of schizophrenia as being a predominantly black disease or a predominantly violent disease. These also are structures that are imbued with the past history, but that are in a way invisible to us because we live in the present. And I just want to conclude by saying a few places where I think understanding history is particularly important for understanding the cultural, the ways that schizophrenia functions in the present day. The first is intervening into American cultural attitudes about schizophrenia and violence. I mentioned before that there are a host of studies that basically say police or whoever believe that schizophrenia is a violent disorder. And often in these studies they say, we found out that they have these stigmatizing attitudes, so what we do is we train the police that schizophrenia really is a biological medical condition that is the result of brain chemistry. We train them about mental illness. Now I think that's incredibly important. There's a lot of stigma out there about mental illness. But just from a historical perspective, the stigma about schizophrenia intersects with beliefs and attitudes and changing perceptions about race. So if you're only addressing the mental illness part, in a way you're only talking about half of this particular story. A second place that I think that it's important to think about the history of schizophrenia is in relation to the ways that I believe schizophrenia still functions in subtle ways as a protest metaphor or a protest trope. Now the way I get at this in the book is to do what was probably the most fun bit of research, which is looking at lyrics databases. You can actually do searches of lyrics in these amazing databases that will search the lyrics of every song ever done. And so what I did was first, with a student of mine, we looked for the terms depression or depressed. And it turns out that overwhelmingly, if you put this into these lyrics databases, you'll get artists like America Styx, Celine Dion, Joni Mitchell, the Eagles, Annie DeFranco, people who are basically, a certain genre of artists, and they're talking about depression as being like a sad, withdrawn mood condition, and people might be able to think about that. If you type in the word schizophrenia, or most notably schizophrenic, overwhelmingly, and with great apologies to Tupac, whose words should never appear on a PowerPoint slide at an academic lecture, you overwhelmingly see rap and hip-hop artists, and not only rap and hip-hop artists, but rap and hip-hop artists who define themselves as being schizophrenic. What they say is, yeah, I'm schizophrenic, and that actually makes me more of a threat to other rappers or to the police. In a way, they're basically using schizophrenia as a kind of boast, as a kind of protest, and saying, it makes me more unpredictable in a particular way. Now, there are many ways to understand what's going on here, but I have to say, I don't think that artists like Tupac or Isham or others are saying, I have a dopamine imbalance in my brain. What I think they're doing is actually referencing the definition of schizophrenia that coursed through black political discourse in the 1960s, which basically says, my insanity is a response to oppression, or it's a response to the cultural milieu. And so to understand it that way, I feel it still functions in very subtle ways as a particular protest metaphor, and I think that's very important because doctors often assume that this is a top-down discourse, but it's not. There are definitions of mental illness that are coming from the community and from society in very important ways. I'm going to run out of time, so I don't have time to talk too much about Beautiful Mind. I'm sure many people in the audience have seen this particular film. It's a very important film. It's also a film that's about a certain kind of white nostalgia. We watch it in my graduate seminar, and we watch it particularly for race. And I'll tell you that the first person of color shows up 4 minutes and 9 seconds to the end of a 2.5-hour movie, where there's an African-American professor who gives John Nash a pen and says the only 2 words spoken by a person of color in the film, "Congratulations, John." Other than that, this movie is a film. I'm sorry, I'm ruining all these movies for you. Other than that, it's a film that importantly reflects the much earlier definition of schizophrenia that came about in the 1930s and 40s about white male genius. Now, of course, I think it's important. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be made. And we have some changes, the movie like The Soloist. But there are also really important works that talk about the conditions of fantastic works like Victor LaValle's The Ecstatic, a novel written by an African-American novelist who himself was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. And in a way, these tell a much more complex story about the relationships between schizophrenia and race, which I guess thankfully don't get made into Ron Howard movies. 2 just very quick concluding points. I talked about cultural competency in the beginning. I think it's important that medicine has started to address the issue of how race and culture and ethnicity play out in the diagnostic examination room. I have 2 critiques of the cultural competency approach in the book. The first is that it's very often the race of the patient or the race of the doctor that people talk about. But what you see from studying history is actually that the diagnosis itself has a racial history that needs to be accounted for. So I argue that there's a third race that functions in the room in different ways, and that needs to be thought of. But also in lines with the Institute here, I also argue that we pay a lot of attention, very important attention, to attitudes in the clinical exam room, but very often just defining something clinically takes it out of the context of culture, politics, society, and importantly, structure. And so I argue that at the same time that we try to become culturally competent, we also need to be structurally competent and to be aware of the ways in which disparities in healthcare and healthcare delivery reflect funding, zoning laws, schools, et cetera, all the kind of things that you're doing here. And in a way, unless psychiatry becomes more involved with social justice issues, it won't, in a way, just talking at attitudes is a kind of window dressing. And the final point is just that the story I tell is also one about the criminalization of mental illness. Now, if you went up to somebody in the 1930s or 40s and said, we put people with schizophrenia in jail, they would look at you like you were a crazy person. Of course, it's not like it was great to be in an asylum at the time, but there was an assumption that there was a social contract to care for people in a particular way. In the present day, if you are in a state institution and you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, according to Human Rights Watch, the chances are 5 to 1 greater that you're in a prison compared to a psychiatric hospital. And of course, that change has to do with a variety of factors, many of which have nothing to do with the analysis in my book. But it also reflects this assumption, this transformation that I trace, which is a transformation from an illness of docility and calm and non-threateningness to an illness marked by a particular kind of threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I would ask that the panelists come forward, and I'll introduce them as they're coming to the table. Jennifer Brown Bunkley received her bachelor's degree at Lehigh University, went on to receive her MSW degree and subsequently her doctorate in clinical psychology and counseling psychology in 2001 from Howard. She has worked both at the University of Maryland and Pediatric Center, has done collaborative research here at the School of Public Health, and over the past few years has been in clinical practice. She has a also extraordinary set of community-based activities. Dr. Grady Dale, and I'll ask each to talk in the order that I'm introducing them. Dr. Dale has had an extraordinary career grounded in Baltimore, where he worked at the University of Maryland in the School of Medicine, was a therapist at the Center for Human Psychology. He has been on the faculty of Bowie State, Morgan Coppin, and he actually is supposed to be teaching right at the minute up on the Homewood campus. So we're pleased that you were. This is a legitimate excuse, isn't it? We're excused from that teaching responsibility. He has been actively involved with Maryland Department of Juvenile Services, with the American Red Cross. He's been the past president of both the Baltimore and the Maryland Psychological Association. Deborah Gross is the Leonard and Helen Stillman Chair in Mental Health and Psychiatric Nursing here in the School of Nursing. She came to Hopkins from Rush University, where she was the Associate Dean for Research and the Department Chair. Her particular area of work, and I've had the opportunity to collaborate closely with her, as I have with a number of the panelists, is in parenting and positive parenting with young children. She and her colleagues developed the Chicago Parenting Program. It's a program that we're looking to incorporate here in Baltimore. She has served as a consultant in early child development for the Harlem Children's Zone and numerous other organizations. And far from last, but last on this roster is Ralph Moore. Ralph is also a Baltimorean who is currently the director of the Community Center at St. Francis Academy. I would imagine almost everyone in the room is very familiar with St. Francis Academy. It is, I believe, the oldest sect of African American nuns with a commitment to education of the most disadvantaged in the African American community here in Baltimore, going back to about 1880.
1828.
I knew it was old. But Ralph was not among the original cohort. And Ralph graduated from Loyola Blakefield and then is a graduate of Johns Hopkins. So thank you all for coming and participating on this panel. And starting with Jonathan's left, let me turn it over to Jennifer. No, just hold.
Just hold it.
Hold
There's
them
two of us.
Okay.
Are you guys able to hear me? Yeah. Oh, wow. I can hear myself. I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to be saying, except that I'm supposed to be sounding intelligent. So I guess I'll just talk just for a minute about some of my thoughts when I read the book. I am honored, by the way, to be here, and I can't believe I'm at your left. This is so really exciting. He touched me. He's famous. So little things excite me. But I guess when I was thinking about what I could say, one of the things that got me as I was reading the book, and this whole concept of not necessarily, and I know I'm not going to say it as well as you, Dr. Metzl, but not necessarily the person themselves being racist or I guess biased in terms of gender, but there kind of being an over, he said it so well, but just that the whole diagnostic process is in many ways, like we all kind of think of it in in a racially biased way, is it made me kind of think back to all the patients I've seen, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, have I misdiagnosed patients? Have I kind of been caught up in this? And, I think that it just, even though a lot of what was being talked about in the book was historically based back in the civil rights era, it just is so prevalent even now, and it really makes you kind of second guess your thought process, and it makes you second guess, well, I did see that patient was schizophrenic, was that patient really schizophrenic? And it really, kind of makes you think through and make sure that you're really looking at the whole person. And looking at it, and some of the vignettes, I could clearly see where, current day, these people would have been misdiagnosed, but I really did like, and I know I'm not going to call it the right term, is it presentism? Mm-hmm. Oh, got it right. Presentism, where he was saying that you have to be familiar with what was available at the time and what the culture was at the time in history. So it's not necessarily a misdiagnosis, because people, 50 years from now could say that we've been misdiagnosing. But based on what we know and what we've learned, we're kind of doing the best that we can. So I just found it a fascinating book, and I'm not sure what else.
That's great.
Did you want me to speak about anything else in particular, or was that okay? All right, I'll just pass it on.
All right. Thank you. I'm supposed to hold it. Which one I hold? Both of them. Number one, I appreciate Dr. Metzl's book. I appreciate his perspective and what he's brought to the table with this. And it's of interest to me that while Dr. Metzl did talk about Iona, he talked about the derivations from the 1920s, 30s into the 60s. And that is a progression, I think, that's very, very important. I think there is a larger progression here, too. There is, from my perspective, a larger picture in terms of culture and diagnosis. Unless you get bogged down in just the narrative. It's very interesting because sometimes this book reads partly like a research paper, and other times it reads like a novel. And I'm trying to figure out which pieces that was Dr. Metzl. Maybe it's both. Maybe he's both. But I think it's very good. The larger picture, I think, is that culture and race and diagnosis, and I'm not telling you anything differently than what you all know today, is a stream that goes directly right up to our doorstep right now. This is not some esoteric or erudite topic that ends with this book, nor begins with this book. This is an important point in history that Dr. Metzl talks about, but it's also continuing today in terms of what we do in terms of race and culture and how we perceive it today. The DSM-4, of course, is trying to codify to some degree the whole business about how you put in cultural issues in terms of dealing with your diagnosis. And I guess, hopefully, DSM 5 will try to do the same. But it's very interesting. I think we have a ways to go. I think that whether it's psychiatric diagnosis or whether it's medical diagnosis, and I have to fuse the two together because we have a racial health disparities picture here. And I can't help but fusing the whole health disparities issue with the diagnostic issue, because either way that you deal with this, you're having difficulties in terms of how people are perceived. And because people are perceived in particular ways that in terms deals with their culture and their economic status, we have a real conundrum here in terms of, how all of these things are fused together, and it's a real bear. Now, it's very interesting. I'm not talking about the psychiatry. I'm talking about our primary care physicians. Again, as you know, lest you think that race and culture and diagnosis is just the purview of psychiatry, psychology, social work. It's not. What is it the purview of? Where are most of the antidepressant medications given from? It's given from primary care physicians. We have to take that into consideration because that, I think, is a ground point, a ground zero in terms of all the things that we're talking about. And I think the mental health professions have a role to play, but it gets larger than that. By the way, just as an aside, my wife grew up in Chicago and she worked in Michigan. She knows about Ionia, and it was very interesting, the stories. My stepson also did a medical internship at Jackson State Hospital, Jackson State Prison, which is notorious also at the same time. But when you get into these issues about who gets served, again, look at this book as a snapshot. This is a snapshot. And just for my purposes here, I know hopefully I'm not running out of time, Dr. Metzl gave a wonderful rendition of what it is to lecture. And very interestingly enough, he wrote a conclusion. But let me, if I could take just 30 seconds to read something that he wrote. He got passionate about something before he got to the conclusion. In fact, the chapter before the conclusion is where I thought he had the passion. But let me read what he said, if I may, if you allow me to. It's on page 197. And interestingly enough, he starts this off by talking about rap music. And when Dr. Metzl was talking about rap music, he went on to say, he said, rap lyrics remind us that diagnosis is an inherently political interaction between diagnostic terminology, because diagnostic terminology is inherently politicized. Now, he kind of skirted around that, but this is where he dropped the bomb on me when he said this. Psychiatric definitions provide levels of clarity for patients and families struggling to understand painful life events. Psychiatric diagnosis also serves as the first step towards treatment and palliation, if not complete cure. But wholesale acceptance of psychiatric terms and frameworks involves entry into a potentially racially subjugating symbolic order in which biomedical definitions of illness supplant cultural ones. Here, the doctor diagnosis serves as an entry port into a cascade of reinforcement. Biomedical diagnosis becomes requisite for insurance company reimbursements. Now, he's getting real down to earth here. The longer patients stay in the system, the more diagnosis they accrue. Over time, persons with schizophrenia become doubly stigmatized, both by the diagnosis that carries poor prognosis and by the medical system that forces acceptance of hegemonic descriptors of well-being at the expense of autobiographies of protest or survival. To enter the doctor's rhetorical system, rhetorically speaking, is to give up the fight. And I thought that when I read that, if he didn't say anything else, I think that kind of encapsulated how I felt in terms of the intersection and the nexus between diagnosis, racially charged issues, and culture. My last statement is this. Dr. Metzl knows, and all you know in the room, this is not a one-way street. We, people of color, have to deal with this too, in terms of how we deal with diagnosis and the perceptions that we bring with us to the table when we are diagnosing, quote unquote, our own people. Now, that's the thing that has not been mentioned, and I think that's something we have to keep in mind. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I must have been the only one here who's nervous. I wrote the whole thing out. But I won't do that. Well, first of all, when I read this book, I thought that this book, which was wonderful, vindicates every African-American mother I know who's walked out of therapy after the initial visit, who's refused a diagnosis for her child even when all the evidence to the contrary suggests the child's ill, and refuses any medication for her child, even when that medication could help their suffering and their children's suffering. And for that, I think that we have to understand that there's a rationale for why our treatments, as much as we have good intentions, may not be acceptable. We've come a long way since Ionia State Hospital, but in some ways I think that maybe we haven't. Two recent reports just came out about that antipsychotic medications are increasingly being prescribed for children, some as young as 2 years old. And much of it is off-label. And the greatest increase in antipsychotic medication use is among poor children. Children covered by Medicaid are being prescribed antipsychotic medications at 4 times the rate as children who are privately insured. This increase is occurring despite the fact that there are known metabolic problems that increase the children's risk of diabetes, and the fact that we have very limited information about how these drugs affect children's brain development, especially when they're started this young. And over the same period, this study also found that there's been a significant decrease in the proportion of young children receiving behavioral and psychotherapies. And I suspect these are not coincidental changes in mental health practices, but rather a sign of our times. No doubt the psychiatrists are faced with enormous barriers to engaging families in behavioral therapy. These include inadequate reimbursement rates for mental health treatments, fear for the safety of the children and their families, and the enormous difficulties they have getting overwhelmed biological or foster parents to engage in the very lengthy interventions designed to reshape their children's behaviors. And not unlike Ionia State Hospital, which at its height employed only 5 psychiatrists for almost 1,500 patients. There are not nearly enough qualified clinicians to address our growing mental health concerns in this country, especially for our children. And under these circumstances, tranquilizing children so they don't hurt themselves or anyone else can seem like a logical course of action. But it can't be our best solution, not in such an affluent nation where it's so dependent on the health and well-being of its children. In the protest psychosis, we learned how the asylums of the early 20th century became the new prisons of the 60s and 70s. Since that time, our jails have evolved into the new long-term psychiatric facility. In 2001, the GAO reported that thousands of families desperate for mental health services for their children were choosing to relinquish custody of their children to mental health to the juvenile justice system so their children could get mental health services. And yet an enormous number of articles vividly describe the juvenile prisons as frighteningly similar to the Ionia State hospitals. They're overcrowded, understaffed, unsafe, unmanageable, let alone therapeutic, and the children in need of real services instead receive multiple psychotropic drugs in lieu of behavioral therapies or psychotherapies. The protest psychosis teaches us that even when health professionals think we are doing things in the best interest of our patients, we are all victims of the times that we live in. Psychiatric diagnoses are context dependent, yet in this country, all treatment begins with a diagnosis. This is a problem. So there's much to be learned from Dr. Metzl's thoughtful book, but to me the 3 most important lessons are these 3. We need to accept the limitations of our current system for rendering diagnoses and rethink our profession's heavy reliance on their validity for guiding mental health care, particularly for young children. Second, we need to better understand why the most vulnerable in our society are so reluctant to embrace our good intentions, and then develop ways to engage them in effective and acceptable treatments. And finally, as a society, we need to invest in mental health care as if our futures depended on it. Sadly, this is going to require a sea change in the way we approach mental health treatment in our country. To that end, I'm hoping Dr. Metzl's book would be a wonderful beginning catalyzing agent. Thank you.
Hello?
Hi.
I guess I'm the only one on the panel that doesn't have a background in psychiatry or whatever. I guess I'd be one of the patients or something. I don't know. I wrote down some because I've been involved in protest over the years. Many of the people in this room have, I'm sure. And I wrote some notes down not because I was so nervous, but I'm a scatterbrain, and so I want to make sure I cover what I wanted to. I was thinking about some of the more famous protesters from history and how they were perceived by the larger society. The first one that came to mind was Nat Turner. And William Styron wrote a book in 1967 that got him the Pulitzer Prize. And it was called The Confessions of Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a slave who revolted in 1831 down in Virginia. A number of people were killed. And he confessed to a lawyer down there. And from that document, which is fairly brief, William Styron wrote a book that was, part novel and part history. And I don't remember. I think I have a copy buried somewhere at home, but I'm sure that people. I mean, the book was criticized by many, especially in the African American community. It was defended by James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison, but there were many others who criticized it because they essentially thought that Styron made Nat Turner look crazy, violent, crazy, and there might have even been the word schizophrenia in there. We can go back and check. But Nat Turner was a slave, and why should anybody revolt from slavery, I guess, would be the question. You get up early, you get to work hard all day in the hot sun, you get to go to bed late, you get half the day off on Christmas. Why should you be unhappy? But I remember from another book from college, Viktor Frankl's book. Viktor Frankl, who died in the Nazi concentration camps, lost everyone in his family, right? And the quote that stuck in my mind from that book was when he wrote that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. And so we've got to think of how these people were reacting to the circumstances that they saw. And I have Toussaint Louverture as one of the more famous protesters. The Black Panthers and Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago, who were killed. I think J. Edgar Hoover, in terms of the most wanted list, said that they were the most dangerous. They named Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers as some of the most dangerous people in America. Malcolm X and the Black Muslims, and things change over time. Malcolm X would have been shocked that just a few short years ago his picture appeared on a postage stamp. He would not believe if anybody told him that would happen, but it did happen. People's perception. Harriet Tubman is considered quite heroic now, but this is somebody who pulled a gun on people and helped people escape to the Underground Railroad, and she's quite heroic. The prisoners of Attica, the state prison in western New York State, not too far from Buffalo, who took over that facility in 1971. These were protesters, George and Jonathan Jackson, Angela Davis. Kathleen Cleaver was a member of the Black Panther Party, and she was married to a fellow named Eldridge Cleaver. So it wasn't just men, but a lot of these. It's interesting, and again, my thoughts tend to be somewhat random, stream of conscious, I suppose. At one point, not too long ago in this city, we had one of the highest percentages, if not the highest percentage of boys in special ed in the Baltimore City Public Schools. And they were remanded to special ed because they were behavior problems. They couldn't sit still, so they said, okay, you go to special ed. It was a way of teachers getting them out of their classrooms and out of their face and out of their hair, pretty much. And that could have been a stigma for life, certainly. And in some it was, although he will tell you, he being Congressman Elijah Cummings, that he was in special ed at one time. The other thing that struck me about this book, and again, thank you for writing it. I like books that help us understand how things got this way. Black people aren't lazy and crazy and stupid and all that. We've been put in a game that you can't win. And a lot of things have been set up to make sure that is the case. I just finished another book called Not in My Neighborhood, which I highly recommend, by Antero Piatella. He was a Baltimore Sun reporter, but he writes about changing neighborhoods in Baltimore. And one of the things that struck me about this book and that one was the discussion of eugenics. That they talk about how this junk science existed, and it influenced policies and practices. It influenced policies and practices in housing, and Antero documents that in his book. The Federal Home Owner Loan Corporation, which preceded the FHA from the Roosevelt administration, drew these maps and decided where loans would go and they color-coded the maps. And so the blue houses were the best, and the yellow houses were nice, and the green ones were good, and the red ones were where you didn't want to make loans, and they happened to be the neighborhoods where poor and black folks lived. And so the term redlining doesn't come from an effort to stop discrimination. It was the federal government who coined that phrase redlining, and when you looked at their map, all the red lines were the areas that they designated. And they based that on a system that you know, whites were better, and I think African Americans were at the bottom, except Mexicans were a little bit lower in that scheme. But Dr. Metzl talks about eugenics in this book too, and how it's junk science, but it had a lot of influence. It's amazing how it had that impact. So anyway, I highly recommend that other book too, because again, it helps us begin to understand why society is the way it is now. Nonviolence versus self-defense, I made a note here. That was essentially the Martin versus Malcolm dichotomy. And even though Malcolm was associated with violence, he was essentially saying we need to defend ourselves. Martin Luther King was upsetting the apple cart too. I mean, the demonstrations and the sit-ins and all the civil rights efforts really were changing society, and they made people nervous. I was 11 years old when the March on Washington occurred, and a neighbor came to my mother and asked if she could take me, my two brothers, and her son to the march, and she said no. And it was because there was a feeling that there was going to be violence breaking out there. And there wasn't. It was a most peaceful, calm day. People can remember, much like the Million Man March back in 1995. Then I have a note here, the status quo versus change, that these protesters, because they were not happy with the way things were, but society is pushing back down on them and saying, well, you're crazy. I mean, we ran to read Black Rage when I was in high school and in college, because you were somehow perceived to be nutsy. Come on, Barksdale, help me here. You know, you were considered nutsy because you were protesting things, and you were active, you had a big afro, you picketed, you went to meetings and all that, you passed out flyers, and you were somehow an outlier. And I guess what was supposed to mean was that you should accept things the way they were, and they were totally unacceptable. So we ran to read Black Rage by Cobb and Greer, and I highly recommend it. That it was healthy, they essentially, was the message we drew from it. It was healthy to be enraged and to protest the status quo. We hadn't seen that in anywhere official before. I have a note here. I had a little piece of Langston Hughes here. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plains seeking a home where he himself is free. And then in the parentheses he writes, America never was America to me. The corporate look. It's amazing that in corporate America, you've got to look a certain way to be acceptable if you're an African-American male. You better have your hair short, you better not have any facial hair, and you better talk real polished and appropriate. And it's interesting, I don't want to steer too far, but it's interesting the bind that our president finds himself in. He's an African-American male, and if he even ekes in the direction of appearing angry about anything, you know, he gets a lot of gas back, right? I mean, he spoke about the Massachusetts Police Department and had to retract his statement and have a beer summit and all that kind of thing. But it's okay to be angry, and he has every right to be. I mean, he's an African-American male, but they won't let him. It's interesting, he announced today that he was going to change the nuclear policy, a very nonviolent type of thing, which I expect him to get a lot of gas for that too, because he's going to get gas for everything he does, right? You name it, if he says the sky is blue. Anyway, I've already talked about Nat Turner. The book came out in 1967, and I highly recommend that too. And I end on the thought that Frederick Douglass left us with. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never would. That's where so many of us find ourselves, that the status quo is not acceptable. And to attempt to change the status quo has cost. But that's costed that so many are willing to pay, because it's just not right the way things are. So I appreciate this book. I found it very informative, and I think it's helpful very much to the cause. I'm not a psychiatrist. I didn't understand a number of the terms in there, but I think it's still very useful, and the larger point is made. And I feel like it was somewhat of a polemic, somewhat in defense of those of us who've chosen a life to protest. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Jonathan, before we open it up for a few minutes, do you have thoughts, comments, given some of what was said?
Well, just briefly, because I would love to hear from the audience, and I guess we're going to, is there something after also, or is it?
Yeah, there's a reception, like, out there.
Okay, great. So I'll just say very briefly, first, thank you so much for those incredibly great and thoughtful comments. Just a few points that jumped out at me. The issue that came up between a few of the comments about the importance of diagnosis and, the question of right versus wrong diagnosis and what I was kind of playing with in terms of misdiagnosis. Now, this is a slight amount of sour grapes on my part, which is that the book has been pretty well received and engaged with, and I've gotten very strong press from JAMA, The Nation, et cetera. The one place where I feel like I've gotten a lot of pushback has ironically been from the American Journal of Psychiatry. There was a review that came out the other day that basically said that I was accusing doctors of being racist. I know everybody's, of course, they don't want to get a bad review or something, so it might be in part sour grapes, but I do feel like, the point that that is exactly not what I'm saying in a certain kind of way, that in a way thinking about this as individual racism is itself a way of not dealing with what's going on here, which to me is a process of racialization, which is to me a much bigger question of not so much the right and wrong of an individual kind of attitude or something, but this bigger way in which our society maintains or perpetuates certain kinds of power structures. And I think that's very important for doctors and patients to be aware of. And so what I say is that even when you're making the right diagnosis, this issue of culture and race is still important. Even if it's not just the times where we make the wrong diagnosis that this is an issue. It's also saying that if you're not aware that the diagnostic system itself is part of society and represents a particular power structure, that you kind of have to be aware of that. And I feel like that's where this understanding of kind of cultural competency needs to be, because diagnoses have different meanings. And so I really appreciate the fact that that was kind of inherent in the comments, was the idea that this is really a story about racialization. It's also not just a story about African Americans. I mean, this is in part a book about whiteness and about anxiety about social change and how society responds and how society doesn't respond. And I think about that a lot because it's hard, kind of thinking about those comments, it's hard not to study the 1960s and be kind of jealous in a certain kind of way if you come from the background I do. I mean, I'm interested in these topics in part because, as Bob knows, my family is very political. My dad and his parents escaped the Holocaust. We've had a long history in my family of awareness of what happens with the excesses of power. And in the 60s, reading that stuff, I mean, it's like the idea that change was possible, whether or not it was going to happen, seemed like a viable alternative. Garbage workers protested and teachers protested, people were out in the streets, and I feel like in part what happened in the aftermath of that was increasing disparity between not just rich and poor, but between people and government, between the possibility of change in a way. So the idea of protest itself, you do kind of have to be crazy to protest in the present day in a certain way, and I'm just saying that kind of tongue-in-cheek, except to say that, that's something I feel like we've lost, and particularly, I mean, it's not like the
Tea Party.
Exactly. That's a good point. That's a good point. But the Martin Luther King, the Martin Luther King who was alive in the 60s was not the Martin Luther King of Martin Luther King Day now. It wasn't a Benetton advertisement. It was the possibility that we're going to change society, and some people got very anxious about that. And in a way, that's very much part of the story as well. And then I would just say, I mean, many different avenues to go here, but I guess I'll just say as a clinician, to respond to some of the clinical points, I've faced these issues in my own practice as well. I've had, for my first book, I worked on drug ads, and I was saying they're just representing, women as mothers, and it's just a throwback to Freud. And then I'll have somebody come in to my clinic, and they'll hold up the same ad that I've been writing about and say, this is me in this ad, and I want to play with my kids again. Or, African-American men from Detroit diagnosed with schizophrenia coming in. And at those moments, I think it would rightly be called malpractice if I said, sir or madam, you're suffering from a socially constructed problem, and what we need to do is change society rather than treat the individual. I think that's obviously the wrong answer. But I think at that moment, you also have to see how even our most biological definition of illness, medical, psychiatric, whatever, is also reflected through culture. Culture conveys a set of expectations, assumptions, and I think that's really important. So, for me, when people come in with those ads, it's not like I'm going to say then, have you had 2 weeks of depressed mood? Have you had loss of interest? Kind of spout the DSM. I'll say, well, who is the me that you're talking about? Like, what talks to you about that ad? To, in a way, kind of bring the clinical and cultural conversations together. And that's where I think this kind of thing is important is, again, whether or not there is a diagnosis or a prescription or something, to be aware of the fact that there are multiple respectful definitions of what it means to have an illness, I think is the most important point of why I think history is important.
Thank you again. Let's open it for a couple of quick comments, questions.
Thank you for an extraordinarily interesting and compelling afternoon. I want to raise a question and introduce an additional element, and that is whether we contribute to racialization through our diagnostic categories by race, and whether we wittingly or unwittingly contribute to that. And is this a symptom of our culture and our society that really should be purged? Because in a sense, by having categories in terms of black, white, and other, we hide so many of the social ills by assigning it to a particular racial category, when the reality is we're dealing with issues of poverty, absence of health care, poor housing, poor education, a whole range of issues, whether we're dealing with schizophrenia or we're dealing with the welfare system, when in reality there are far more whites who have X or Y or Z, but we speak of it in racial categories. And I just wonder what this learned panel might think about that.
Well, a couple of things. First, I've been honored to be part of the BIDIL conversations that have been happening. There's a series of conversations in Boston about the antihypertensive drug BIDIL that supposedly works more in African Americans, but the science is very suspect, shall we say, and people have been critiquing it. It was really interesting at this conference because there were all of these academics of many different backgrounds and stripes who got up and said, basically, the research is false. And then the head of the Black Cardiology Association got up and said, you're missing the point, actually, that in a way this is not just a top-down categorization. This is also conveys to us, we get funding, we get marketing, we get all of these kind of things in a way. And so he was arguing in a way against the academics to say, race has this particular meaning, and it's a way of recognizing our community that hasn't been recognized in a way before. And so I think that's really important. And also, I think it's always important to remember that race doesn't exist in a vacuum. When you study history, it's amazing how much even the categories of race themselves are constantly changing. But I'm very influenced by people who say that, race is an intersectional concept, that you can't talk about race without talking about class and gender and other kinds of issues. And so the ways, I think we've, through those categories, gotten to a much more nuanced understanding of not just, poverty, but privilege and other kinds of things. And so, I think our definition of race has forced exactly that kind of thing, which is, do we throw it out or do we force it to be more complex? And I'd also be curious to hear what other...
Well, my feeling, as Dr. Metzl, for example, talked about Thomas As and R.D. Lang, we've gone through ups and downs and periods. I think, I almost have to view the diagnostic nomenclature as a part of the economic and free market system. We we live in a culture where you either have it or you don't. And, you know, as much as we would like to purge or get rid of that, I think how we rein that in and how we evolve over time where lots of people, not only mental health people, but just populations as a whole, get it that there's a stigmatization that happens with all of this, and as we lessen the stigmatization, then maybe we'll kind of get somewhere. But you know, again, in a culture where we live in, where money counts, money sells, drugs sell, and so therefore, in my opinion, diagnosis sells. In my practice, you know, I bill insurance. I can't bill insurance without a diagnosis.
I just want to make a slight comment about it. I'm just appalled about how little people were interested in this today. Because it's very important to me, living through the 60s up to now, and that the protesters are becoming complacent and they have a lot of apathy. And I still think that the racism that was in the 60s, the protest that was in the 60s, still need to go on today. I mean, living the life and working with kids in the city and watching how they're marginalized, and just in school and everything else by just their race, more so than the diagnosis first. But it's the paradigm that the treating people have when they see that face in front of them. Mm-hmm. That from their training, from their exposure, they begin to diagnose by just looking at the person. It's already a pre-con conclusion that this person has something going on because they are upset and angry about the way they live, upset and angry about the money that they don't have, and upset and angry about the other things they're not able to enjoy as being part of this society. And I just wanted to throw that out.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think going back to Dr. Page for a second, one of the things that I'm hopeful about is that to some extent young people are looking past the race thing, but not looking past it. You know, and I think they were excited to go out and work, enough to go out and work for Barack Obama, and to convince their parents to go and support Barack Obama. And I think the Tea Party movement is mostly old folks. I mean, if you look at the camera pans, these aren't young people. These aren't college age and younger. This is old folks. And you know, some of the descriptions that Dr. Metzl put on the slide here could apply to some of them, or would be applied to some of them, I would think, if you had to sit some of them down. But I think what is hopeful to me is that the young people weren't willing to support Barack Obama and try to pretend he's not black. You know, because that's what people used to say about you know, Bill Cosby and Tiger Woods and Oprah Winfrey. They're not black.
Sidney Poitier.
Sidney Poitier, yeah, they're not black, but they are black. And Barack Obama is black. Now, some people are trying to say, you know, first of all, he was born in a foreign country, and you know, that's what he gets from some on the white side, and from the black side, he ain't black enough. He's only mixed or something like that. You know, the poor man. I love the guy. But that's what's hopeful to me. The people are accepting it, and they're seeing that as a positive. It's not something we should be ashamed of. It's something we ought to embrace. It's too much in society. We've used it as a way to control. That's the whole point of all of this, I think, and to keep people down, and again to maintain the status quo.
Last comment or question, and then we will need to break for overtime. We have a reception, and there'll be time to interact with the panel.
Well, it's just a very provocative, loaded discussion, especially with the richness of the panel. But I used to drag my kids to Washington all the time. In fact, God, we didn't get hauled down to the police station or something. But my kids grew up here with Tupac Shakur, and they were in that generation. And when I think, Doctor, are you still in Detroit?
Yeah, Ann Arbor.
In Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
I think about Michigan a lot lately. So, I mean, I think about Baltimore because I grew up here, and it's a city that's gone through so much. But Detroit is a city that a lot is happening to. And when we talk about I guess, protests in prisons and hospitals morphing into prisons and vice versa. I think about Detroit right now and something that happened just in the last month that people might not say is psychiatric, but on the other hand, the way they took care of the Black Panthers, you know, it was murder. And one of the things that happened in Detroit was a black imam was murdered. There's real questionable circumstances that the Justice Department is looking at. But on the other hand, these white guys that wanted to kill policemen, they were all arrested. Nobody was hurt. There's still, to me, exists even if, you know, and it's all in the same, the paradigm is sort of like walking right next to the other. It's all still happening. It might be decentralized, we might not be hearing about it, but people to a certain extent are still being dealt with either by being diagnosed or by being murdered if there are too many problems with them, like Malcolm X, like Tupac, like other prophets. And I love psychiatry, I love healing the soul. But on the other hand, I think lots of times the criminal justice system and psychiatry collide. I mean, it's just a lot of things that came up with the panel.
Yeah.
It's just all sort of, it gets very mixed up.
Excuse me, I have to say, to add fly to this ointment, look who Malcolm X was murdered by.
Yeah.
Malcolm X was murdered by another piece of the Muslim sect.
Jonathan, you get the last word.
Well, just two things. I would say that, I mean, I won't make a joke about crazy white people in Michigan right now, but I will say that, you know, that part of what's, I mean, you know, we've seen a lot of progress since the 1960s in terms of, you know, in terms of attitudes, in terms of opportunities, and also in terms of psychiatric treatments. And so part of what I think the lesson of the 1960s is in looking at that Haldol advertisement, for example, it's like somebody needed to stand up at that moment and say, this is not a psychiatric problem, actually. Like, this is a political issue, and what's the mechanism for saying, here's the limit of medical expertise, and here's where we're in another realm where this is a political arena or something. So it's not just about the expansion of psychiatric expertise, it's about a serious, productive conversation about the limitations of what is psychiatric expertise. And the second point is just that, you know, I think that in terms of the question of kind of what to do about kind of people today and stuff like that, like the hard part is I think that there was, again, this move from the 1960s to basically tell people of all backgrounds, your protest doesn't matter. I mean, civilization was really frightened by what happened in the 1960s because capitalism almost turned upside down. And so, again, these distances, so there have been all these points where people then say, you can protest all you want, but it's not going to make any difference. And the nice thing about Obama was actually people said, wow, I did something and it actually mattered. And what happens from there hopefully will be a narrowing between, like, people can actually see you can change the system, but it's always in tension with, you know, these growing disparities, wealth disparities, other kinds of things.
Well, I would say that we had and have no delusion that in a session or an entire series we will resolve these very complex issues. I think our hope is that through dialogue, through conversations such as this, we do come to better insight and a better understanding that inches us toward both not only better treatments and better diagnoses, but a better society. So I want to thank you, Dr. Metzl, and the entire panel for a really wonderful opportunity.